We're going to carry on our discussion from Tuesday. There's a new page on Canvas on simulation and simulacra. It has the very short story on one side, and it has a number of links to the things that we showed in class last time, the English and the American versions of the paper. I showed you the YouTube clips and the YouTube clip about cell phones replacing reality. Did any of you look at the links Matt Anderson put on the HCI Facebook page? The Louis C.K. link? No. Yeah, it was fantastic. I should show that really. It's the comedian Louis C.K. talking about going to see his daughter's dance rehearsal, and every parent is stood with a phone. And he said, obviously he swears a lot as well, but he's saying, and these parents even are holding iPads. You know, he's saying, you know, you're never going to watch the video. You can't even be bothered to watch your kid now. You know, so, but he says you're going to put it on Facebook for other people who won't watch it. You know, and this idea that everyone's sitting watching their kids at an event through just what we were talking about. And Gold posted then below that a really interesting video from one of the developers of Google Glasses, who's given a talk about Google Glasses. And he starts by saying exactly the same thing, that whenever he goes to an event or a concert, everyone stands with a mobile phone. He says, so we mediate the experience through this device. He says, that's why we want the glasses to make that more natural. That you're still watching the event, but the glasses are recording if you want to. So we're not, so he's saying we're not putting a device in the way. I think we could argue with that, but both of those clips were really fascinating. So, yeah. Couple of little. I want to throw out a few things just to start a conversation. Do you want to pass those back? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Few things I just want to throw conversation pieces. One, a quote I read. I was reading this article. It's an essay online called Trans-Humanism and Post-Reality. I didn't think it was actually very good. Too good, but it referenced something I found really interesting. Someone called Eric Davis, I don't know this book, but he talks about, Eric Davis writes in his book, Technosis, or Gnosis. Human beings have been cyborgs for years, he said. And this made me think of all the things Patrick has been saying about objects we make and how we put ourselves into objects. It is our lot to live in societies that invent tools that shape society and the individuals in it. For millennia, people not so dissimilar to ourselves have constructed and manipulated powerful and impressive technologies, including information technologies, and these tools and techniques have woven themselves into the social fabric of the world. So I don't know this book, but that quote kind of spoke to me of what the things we've spoken about. And I'd like us to talk about all cyborgs. I think it's, by the very definition of things we've been talking about, the way technology alters us, yes, we are. But I found this other paper, the one I've just handed out. It's really a little bit of a review, an essay review, a journalist or a commentator talking, a blogger talking about an essay. And it compares the work of three people. I've heard of these, I've not read the works of Germain and Virilio, is it pronounced? But Patrick, Patrick knows some of this stuff. But it was a nice little essay, and he talks about the key assumptions regarding what it means to be human. And the paragraph, it talks about all sorts of things, all of this quite generally. Oh, here it is. This is the quote I wanted to talk about. This is quoted in something else as well. I love this idea. He talks about the mania for transparency and total illumination, evident in televisual imagery. Think of the way Blu-ray discs and plasma TVs are promoted as giving us clearer images than their respective predecessors. So, according to Baudrillard, this comes at the cost of a kind of distance that the human body cannot bridge, in contrast to one's ability to cross distances, separating one from things in everyday spatial reality. And we're back to Heidegger again. I read about this in something else I'm going to show you in a moment. There was a set of notes, and they talked about exactly the same concept. If we get a more realistic television, what we're actually doing is, it's like Borges' map. We're making a better map, something that simulates the real world better, but it's still not real. So what we're doing is making our simulation better, and you could argue that with that, as we make the simulation better, we separate ourselves more from reality, which is the point they're trying to make here. Blu-ray is a really good example of that, and high-def TVs, that we're creating these artificial devices that supposedly make things more real, but as they become more real, they separate us from reality even more. So, and he continues to talk about this with relation to Heidegger. So, I thought this was a really interesting kind of point to think about. And this is on the page. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's a slide share discussing Baudrillard in relation to modern media. So this is all about mobile phones, media saturation, phone calls for stalling contact, mobile phones being replaced with text messaging, and discusses it in relation to Baudrillard. And it has the same definition when it comes to speaking of, here we are, the same things about discussing as we get to high definition, making more reality available. This increase in interactivity only serves as an even greater simulation. So the same kind of concept being discussed. And that means greater loss of symbolic experience. And the last one I wanted to show you, again, this is on the page. This popped up in my newsfeed about an hour ago. And it was exactly the things we were talking about. Patrick has spoken a lot about the acquisition of language, that this is when we gain the sense of self. And there are obviously people who disagree with you, Patrick, and have decided they're going to measure consciousness by electrical activity.
I'm down with that.
And this article in Science Now, I follow a number of science feeds, and this just came in. It said, everyone looks at an infant and wants to know. So what they started doing is putting all the neural sensors on babies, and constantly measuring what they've been doing. And what they are saying, the new research is showing that babies display, I like this scientific term, glimmer, because a glimmer is a little bit more than a nuance. Display glimmers of consciousness. What's a glimmer of consciousness? Is it a lot? Is
that in the report? Does it say that?
Hmm?
Does that
I don't know. I've only seen this article. I've only just read this. So. For decades, neuroscientists have been searching for unmistakable signals of consciousness in electrical brain activity. And I like this idea. She could determine whether coma victims, people minimally conscious or anesthetized, are aware and when consciousness begins in babies. So what they did, they looked at all the studies on adults when adults detect something, moving objects, vision center activates, even if the object's going too fast for you to really identify. If the object remains in your visual field for long enough, the signal travels from the back to the prefrontal cortex, which holds that image in your mind so that you can notice it. And that's when you see this spike in brain activity when the sensors pick something up. And another signal, we get this late slow wave when the prefrontal cortex gets a message. They call it the late slow wave. It takes less than a third of a second, but, you know. So what they've done is they've started looking for that two-step pattern in infants, and they monitor the child's brain activity, 240 babies, so, and they look for it. And they're shown these pictures of faces on screens for fractions of a second. And they watch for the swings in electrical activity. Babies who are at least 1 year old, you get similar patterns to adults, but it was about 3 times slower. But what they showed was that 5-month-olds still show a late slow wave, though it was weaker and more drawn out. So they're saying that it's speculating it may be present in babies as young as 2 months. This is, I guess, a very controversial statement. I like the way they use may. This late slow wave may indicate consciousness. And so it reported in the journal Science today. So what they're saying is even at 2 months, children are storing this image. And they're saying in the working memory, and consciousness, Calder says, is composed of working memory. So, interesting work. They talk about, then go on to talk about the problems of comparing child and adult brainwaves. So, any comments or questions on that?
I mean, wouldn't consciousness be like as soon as you're born, maybe before?
So I didn't hear that.
Wouldn't consciousness be like as soon as you're born, and like if a baby can cry, you know, like as soon as it's born, like isn't that conscious? I mean, that to me is like a
I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer to that, but we argue that humans are conscious. I mean, there are people who argue, you know, that the fetus is, you know, it's alive, but, you know, at a certain point it becomes alive. Does it become conscious? I don't know. But I've never seen anything like this before, where they're actually stating that there is a particular time you can see from electrical activity that a child becomes conscious of something. And there was all sorts of things this popped up in my mind, is that the consciousness they are talking about is related to vision. That the child sees some things and remembers it. So it's all about this sensory input, having the sensory input in, and the child being able to remember something, is then when it is defined as conscious. Or at least
the signal moves from the back of the brain to the prefrontal cortex, indicating that there's some kind of possibility of attention, that this image could be noticed potentially.
Yeah.
But the problem here is one that has no solution, in part because our ordinary language is so confused on these matters. Jacques Derrida has a statement that he makes of grammatology where he says, there is no perception. There is no perception. What he means by this, I think, and I'm not alone in this, but what he seems to be suggesting by this statement is that we always already have to have something that he'll call writing, or what we might loosely understand as language, but not speech. There has to be a system of differentiation, a system of differences that allows for perception to happen. So if I'm going to perceive something, there was nothing, then there was something, and then there was nothing. If an image moves through, I'm thinking of the child in these scenarios. So the child, let's imagine, sees a bird flying by, and so it's out in its baby carriage for a stroll, and it's looking up at the sky, and it's 5 months old or something. Let's imagine a bird moving across the child's view. That signal may come from the back of the brain into the prefrontal cortex. But in order for there to be perception there, what someone like Derrida is going to suggest is there has to be already a condition that's prepared to be alert to differentiation. Nothing, then something, then back to nothing, in the simplest kind of way. And so for Derrida, if you have that system of difference, that's essentially what he's going to mean by writing. That writing, which is one of his fundamental words for the conditions upon which we have things like speech and the kind of penmanship that we do with our hand. This newer understanding, this different understanding of what he's going to call writing or graphing, it has to, in some ways, precede perception. Now this is completely counterintuitive, right? This is completely counterintuitive because we often think, well, we can't make sounds, we can't have language without having seen things and heard things, and then we come to some awareness of their differences and so on. But Derrida is like saying there's kind of there's a differentiation, there's a complex system of differentiations, traces we'll sometimes call them, marks we'll sometimes call them, and it's on the basis of these things that consciousness becomes possible. I think if we got someone who is a sophisticated Derrida scholar to sit down with someone who does the neurophysiology of brain studies and they kind of worked on their vocabularies, I think we could probably find a vocabulary where we could translate from one of these discourses to the other. But I think it's very difficult for us to do in an ordinary casual way.
I'm still with the idea that I still find it counterintuitive.
Sure. Let me just propose that we shift our perspective a little bit. If there's anybody here who knows more about biology than I do, and that's anybody, you can help me out. But if we think about life as somehow fundamentally constituted through DNA, like what is DNA? DNA is simply an alphabet. I know that's how we represent it, but it's basically systematic differences among these various proteins that form in different kinds of sequences, and then mutate and change and develop. So there's an argument that I suppose could be made that DNA is this kind of system of differentiation itself. So that DNA is a kind of writing upon which other manifestations of writing emerge at different and higher and more highly differentiated levels.
Okay, assuming we accept this idea that we need some sort of system of differentiation before we perceive, then we're still perceiving through that system of differentiation. What does it mean there is no perception?
It doesn't mean there's no perception. That's where.
So he wrote there's no perception.
He wrote it
mean there's no perception.
Right. He wrote it to kind of. This is typical of this problem with all these French theorists and other people who are just trying to show.
They write things that don't mean to confuse you.
Right. If you take them out of context, they're easily misinterpreted. Yeah. But it's a way to jumpstart the idea. One of the things that we have to do when we're working.
So what he actually means is there's no perception without this system.
That's right. There isn't any kind of immediacy to perception. That perception is mediated, and this really doesn't come as a surprise to any of us. We're now very, very comfortable thinking about how all of our very bodies are complex systems of mediation. Right? So it doesn't mean, but here's the problem. We often think of the system of mediation, the channel through which something moves, as somehow something that is not a factor in the message itself. But we know that that's no longer the case either. So we often kind of assign a neutrality. Let me see if I can make this work for narratives. A lot of times we might say it doesn't really matter how you get the story. It's the same story, whether it's a cartoon, an graphic novel, a film, or a printed book, or something that's maybe a printed book in Braille versus an audio book. You might say it's the thing that we're after, the content that we're after is the same. Okay? But in fact, if we stop to think about it, the mediated channel through which that content passes is part of the message.
Absolutely.
It can't be
I have no problem with the concepts.
Right.
I'm happy to agree with that.
Right. But we often naively find ourselves thinking that there's something more permanent to the content of the message that is impermeable, or isn't in some way altered by the media that we use. So we're ambivalent about that problem in practice. No, I think you did fine.
I was just going to, I think that makes sense. To me, it makes sense, especially in the context of like creating an artificial intelligence. Because in order for an artificial intelligence to have perception, first you have to input some kind of differentiation between things that's perceiving. So I think I can kind of understand that. Yeah, in that context.
The trick is that we can't keep throwing around, at some point, it's the point you're making about the word perception, as I was using it when I was summarizing Derrida. At some point, you can't keep falling back into the old vocabulary and pretend but we still somehow do that. Baudrillard is always doing this. He wants to say, well, the real is no longer real. Okay, well, if the real is no longer real, let's call it something else and forget the word real. But he keeps wanting to use the word real. He keeps wanting to hold on to this thing. Because there's something fundamental about our experience where we do want to hold on to the idea that this is real.
Okay, so let me ask you, do people agree with this idea that we don't live in the real world anymore? Or do you just think it's nonsense?
You want to give your best shot, right?
Yeah. I would say that we live in what we perceive to be the real world, and we've augmented it, but just because you're on Facebook 24/7 doesn't mean you're not living in the real world in the you don't exist anymore sense. Maybe not in the you are no longer a functioning member of society sort of way, but you still do exist for at least terms of resource consumption.
So your existence is defined by resource consumption. That's so American.
Well, just think about it. If you have an illness and you go to a physician and the physician says, I think this is in your head.
Well, that's one of Baudrillard discusses that in the book. If I see if I get this argument right, if I can remember the way he puts it, that he says there's a difference between a simulation and a lie about reality. That's not the phrase he uses, but so if I want to day off work and I pretend to be ill, I'm not changing. I am
Counterfeiting or faking?
Counterfeiting or faking reality. I'm not really ill, but I'm faking. But he says there's a common thing that happens where people who pretend to be ill actually get some of the symptoms of the illness. But they don't really have them, but they begin to get it. So then, is that a simulation of the illness, or are they really ill? Or is it still fake? And what he begins to do is apply this in other ways where you see that these things that simulate reality, we live in that world all the time, where there's these simulations around us. Would you say I've got that?
Yeah, I think you're moving in there. That's a fine description of the problem.
Yeah.
I think it's the same, I don't know what it is, but I think that's the same mechanism, like the placebo effect. Like if I gave you a headache and I gave you Tic Tacs and said, hey, these are, migraine medicine, you're like, oh, sweet, and half hour later, yeah, I'm really starting to feel better.
But is that a lie or a simulation? And it's this question, it is a question of language. And when I started reading this stuff, the problem I had was that every time I read simulation, because I build virtual reality simulators, I thought of VR simulators, but that's not what he's talking about. Someone having these symptoms of an illness, it's a simulation. So we've got to think about the word in a much broader context. I feel he's using the word in a much broader context than we use it. Watching a television and seeing the Boston bombing is a simulation, it's not real. It's coming through this medium. We're not having that unmediated experience. Is that
right? I'll just quickly, though, because I think that's my talk, I'll just remind you that a long time ago, I thought it would be useful for us to introduce a distinction between the word the real and the word reality. And I was implying that the real and reality are quite different things. And so that may help us to sort some of these problems out. But John,
yeah, well, that was one thing that actually got hung up on with Baudrillard. He said about like the desert of the real, and the real isn't real anymore. But I mean, it's not like that's different from the Lacanian, the real, right? So he's not talking about the same thing, right? But I mean, to me, I don't know. Maybe I should be mixing the two. But to me, he's just like the simulation we're living in. Well, that's still like the Lacanian idea, I guess. But it's still reality, though. Like our simulations of things, it's not any less our reality, right? Do I understand that correctly?
I think
Yeah. Someone got it. Yes. But not the professors.
well, the simulation has effects.
Right. Okay. So is that all the reality? Is it all?
the simulation has real effect. The simulation affects the real world, but
well, see, I didn't say it affects the real world. I just said
because the real world is also confusing to me. The real world is just a third thing from the real and reality. It's also the real world now.
But you've got to remember, Baudrillard also said that if you think of the example in that very short little YouTube clip that Patrick didn't like the language in, the one that had important. Yeah, he used the word important. But in that clip, when he talked about pilot, he didn't say that the pilot only has a simulated experience because they fire a bomb through a simulator or fire a missile through a simulator. But they have been in simulators to train, therefore the experience they are having flying that plane is an altered experience.
Is it what experience?
An altered, a changed experience.
When they're
because of the when they're flying well, I keep the real plane. Even it starts me thinking, should I use the word real? I don't know. But
the thing that I also kind of guess hung up with Baudrillard is, I mean, he seems to really have a problem with the idea of simulations, and like, I mean, he's just like saying, it's describing the nature of simulation, but saying that this is also, by the way, this is terrible, we got to stop doing this with museums and stuff. Like, I got this really negative connotation from things he was saying, and I guess that's sort of what I have a problem with. Like, am I misunderstanding him?
No, I think you have, but I got a similar feeling.
Yeah.
But I love technology. I don't have a problem with technology, but through this class, I'm finding myself thinking about it in different ways. And this, just in the last week, I've been rereading some of this and reading it. And what I'm beginning to look at more in the context of this class is the idea of all the everyday technology like phones and televisions, and try and expand this concept away from the flight simulators and things like that into the technology affecting us in every day and affecting us as a human, as a society, and as trans-human. How we change, how we are all changing. Right. Like you, I don't have problems with technology. I think it's beneficial. And Patrick's much the same. We're not anti-technology people, but we.
I didn't think you were. This is Baudrillard. I guess I think I like Baudrillard's like what he has to say about simulations, but I think he seems like really defensive. You know, kind of like almost kind of scared of simulating. And I think that like I see it seems like easy to feel that way. Feel like kind of defensive, like, you know, what I think is real is falling apart because simulations are becoming more widely available and more.
But I do find it a fascinating concept to think of ourselves living our lives in the simulation. You know, and it's not a matrix simulation, you know, the matrix movement simulation, but our reality is different because of the technology, and that's a really interesting thought. Sorry, Anthony's had his hand up for ages.
When we work on the definition of simulation, does the real doesn't apply? And you can't say this is real, because with the cold example, obviously the symptoms aren't real.
I'm sorry, which example?
The cold example, like when you believe so honestly that you are sick,
Oh, right.
you have a condition that you manifest those symptoms. So is it a question of completeness in modeling?
Is what a question of completeness?
Simulation. Completeness in modeling, like you have the
The
symptoms.
more complete the model,
Well, you have the symptoms of the cold, but you don't have the entirety of everything associated with it. You're saying that something is real and something is not real. It's real is what's real.
let me give you a sentence that Lacanians like to use. There is no lack in the real. Okay? There is no lack in the real. Now, what the idea here is that consciousness only comes about when there's an absence. Okay? So my being conscious of the pen is not the pen. Consciousness as itself is this kind of absence, an emptiness that gets filled up, so to speak. So there's an absence that is a condition for consciousness, and that's the result of perception and language. If I say the pen, right, the phrase the pen is not the pen. There's a gap between the words the pen and the object.
What I liked about
Is that
it,
covered?
yeah, well, what I liked about what you said before about describing a baby in a carriage and the bird coming across the vision and stuff, and it seemed almost in all cases where you were saying perception, and it's valid perception, the entire argument for perception. It almost seems like it's a little bit of sensory input, just sensory input.
So what's the distinction you make between sensory?
Because sensory input's a pattern, right? It's simply a pattern, like absence, presence, absence, right? And I think under those same conditions, the earliest eyes have been said to evolve. I think perception is like there's some sort of understanding and language.
So perception would be bird, no bird, bird, bird.
Well, understanding the concept of a bird, like there's a bird's flying, versus just some light passing through your eye and some kind of shape or something.
Freud tells the story of the apple pleasure principle. It's a similar sort of thing. He was watching his grandchild, and there's a problem with the translation in English because it's hard to know exactly what the scene is. But either the child is inside of a crib and throwing a spool with a piece of yarn in it outside the crib, and as it throws the spool out away from the crib, it says gone, and then when it brings it back, it says here. It's called the Fort Da game. And so Freud saw that this child, his grandchild, was playing this game. In another version of the story, the child's outside the crib and throws the spool into the crib and then pulls it back. But essentially what the child is doing is playing this game of here, there, right? Here, gone, Fort Da. Freud sees this as a very foundational experience where the child is trying to overcome the trauma of the absent parents. When the parents, the comforting parent puts the child down and disappears, then the child, so there's presence, right? There's something there. Then there's absence, there's lack. So that consciousness emerges out of this interplay between presence and absence. And that these simple childhood-like responses are ways to master that difficulty. I'm not doing justice to the Freud episode, but it sort of extends this out a little bit in a slightly different way.
I think there's a difference between perception and understanding. Speaking about simulations, think about orange soda. Right? When you're drinking orange soda, it's a simulation of what oranges taste like. Right? You're not sitting there thinking, well, right? I mean, you're fooling yourself into oh, the taste of orange, but it's just high fructose corn syrup and yellow 14. You know what I mean? You have no understanding of any of that stuff. You're not going this high fructose because it's delicious. You know what I mean? Wow, this orange is really costing my pizza.
It's a misinterpretation then.
But you're perceiving orange taste and you have no understanding of what those ingredients are. you're not, you know what I mean? Like you've stimulated the experience.
Well, yes.
You know, same thing with like pizza flavored chips.
You know,
It's
just
like-
because of the chips doesn't mean I know everything about everything that's going on surrounding that.
But you're not drinking orange, but your mind is tasting orange.
You're interpreting it.
Yeah, but it's not orange in any way. It's much
But we're coming back to something we talked about in the very first classes, intentionality.
Right.
Which is this thing about consciousness being around by context and having understanding's too simple a word, but an understanding of the context of what is happening. The example that they always use bacon, tasting bacon, you know, it's just the tasting bacon and knowing that you're tasting bacon, but it could be any food. Oranges, you're using oranges. You're talking about this fundamental issue that we can build a robot that has chemical sensors so it knows it's eating orange, but does it understand what orange is? And that's the nature of consciousness that people argue. So particularly uses that argument all the time.
I think I'm learning how to shape a response to that. If we imagine that the robot has several layers of neural nets, then it would have the possibility of one neural net looking at what's the word I'm looking for?
Lower level, I guess.
The activity at the lower level.
Well, the lower levels are the input layers where the sensory
so there could be a moment of interpretation where one higher level of the neural net, it says, this is chemical, what was it?
High fructose corn syrup.
High fructose corn syrup, what was the one?
Yellow 14.
Yellow 14, this is yellow 14, right? So it might say, then there could be another layer in the neural net that would understand what yellow 14 is in relationship to other chemicals like it. So what I think this is Mintz's position, isn't it? That the consciousness would actually be the result of the interaction among those layers.
Yeah.
And I think that's...
but we talk about this a lot with strategic layers of neural nets that run the metacognition, for want of a better word. But, this is the piece from the Baudrillard. I'm going to read you the proper one rather than the American one. The American one has all sorts of examples about credit card fraud and things as well. So it makes this distinction. He calls it, this is the word I don't remember, dissimulate. To dissimulate is to pretend not to have what one has. To simulate is to feign to have what one doesn't have. One implies a presence, the other an absence. So here we are again, presence, absence. But it is more complicated than that, because simulating is not pretending. Whoever fakes an illness to stay in bed and make everyone believe he's ill. Whoever fakes an illness can stay in bed and make everyone believe you are ill. Whoever simulates an illness produces some of the symptoms. Therefore, pretending or dissimulating leaves the principle of reality intact. The difference is always clear, it is simply masked. Whereas simulation threatens the difference between the true and the false, the real and the imaginary. Is the simulator sick or not, given that he produces true symptoms? Objectively, one cannot treat him as being either ill or not ill. Psychology and medicine stop at this point, forestalled by the illnesses, henceforth undiscoverable truth. For if any symptom can be produced, it can no longer be taken as a fact of nature. And therefore, every illness can be considered as simulatable and simulated, and medicine loses its meaning since it only knows how to treat real illnesses according to their objective causes. So you now all know it's a waste of time becoming a doctor. Psychosomatics evolves in a dubious manner at the borders of principles of illness. Psychoanalysis transfers the symptom of the organic, and where do we get to? So we come down to this, but why would simulation be at the gates of the unconscious? Why wouldn't the work of the unconscious be produced in the same way as any old symptom of classical medicine? So this is just one example. He gives other examples in there, but it's worth a look at. And this is what makes you think about the idea of everything around us and things around us being simulated, not real. And it made me think away from technology a little, but yes.
I think, so this one I still have a hard time with is the idea that the simulation somehow like depreciates the value of the original, or whatever you want to, like, what is, I don't really understand when he's saying the effect of the simulation is on the original, or is the...
Not in this chapter, not in this particular section, I don't think. But he's questioning how we perform actions like medicine in the world, I think. Right. You know.
Well, he doesn't. Well, specifically in this passage where he says, you know, well, if you can simulate an illness, then medicine is meaningless now. And that's like a jump that I fail to make with him.
I agree with you that, you know, medicine is not meaningless. We make people better, you know.
Right. Well,
so it's not meaningless. But what I find about this, and something Patrick's been saying all the time, what I see this giving us, I don't agree that medicine is meaningless at all. But what I do see is that this gives us a language and a framework to talk about the nature of reality. Does that make more sense, Patrick?
I lost you there.
No, I think the kind of the framework he's setting up about the real and the way we have these simulated events and simulations through technology that are mediated events around us all the time, he's setting up a way that we can talk about how it's affecting us and how it's changing us as humans. Not that he's saying, well, I think he's. I don't think he's really. I hope he's not questioning the whole of medical science.
His real target here is his understanding of the God. So you see where he says the difference is always clear. It is simply masked, whereas simulation threatens the difference between the true and the false, the real and the imaginary. So those are Lacanian terms, the real and the imaginary. He doesn't.
So this is just an attack on the philosophy.
He is. He's trying to. Baudrillard started out as a Marxist, and his early work as a Marxist was on use and exchange value, which are true fundamental concepts that are the material that Marx uses to start writing Das Kapital. And so Baudrillard really begins kind of as a materialist Marxist. And then he starts to think more and more about things like media and technology and simulation. And he starts to see that this Marxist materialist sense of the real is starting to vanish in these mediated experiences. So when he published an essay in the early Reagan years called The Ecstasy of Communication, where he said reality is being reduced to the screen. He was basically saying in the postmodern time, the material conditions of the culture happen on the screen. When he made this argument, and this was in the period of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and the Marxist left was having a hard time trying to come up with a response to the Reagan and Thatcher era. And so a lot of the Marxists who were reading and identifying with Baudrillard's previous critique of use and exchange value, they said, wait a minute, he's become a right-wing fanatic. Because if we do away with the real, if we do away with reality, we think everything is simulated, then there's no position, there's no place we can go to talk about alienated labor, or to talk about oppression, or exploitation. And so therefore, he's basically giving in to the vocabulary of the dominant capitalist, of the late capitalism, the dominant vocabulary of multinational corporations. They want to level everything off for their own purposes of exploitation. And that became the critique that worked against Baudrillard in the 80s. So for a long time then, in the period between the Reagan years and the Bush Gulf War, the first Bush Gulf War, right, you can see he's struggling to try to find a way to clarify his politics. So that's one reason why he wrote the book, The Gulf War Didn't Happen, or It Didn't Exist. Now, I don't know how much more, do you want more background on this? Or, I mean, I don't want to kill the conversation. But the word simulacra actually shows up in the Vulgate translation of the Christian scriptures. In the third epistle of St. John, this is not a false quotation. In the third epistle of John, we find the last sentence is this: Filioli custodite vosa simulacris. And what that means in Latin is, my little children, guard yourself from idols. The word simulacra in the Vulgate is translating the Hebrew word for idol. And the notion of idolatry speaks to the fundamental Mosaic experience of encountering Yahweh in the burning bush. Right? When Moses comes up to this burning bush in the book of Exodus, Moses asks the burning bush, well, who shall I say sent me when I go back to the Jewish people? And what does the burning bush say? I am who am I? That's the English translation. Okay? The English translation of the, I'll write it for you, because actually it's an unpronounceable word. So this takes us right to the heart of language itself and to this question of the simulacra. Right? This is an unpronounceable word in ancient Hebrew, I'm told. Okay? And so only twice a year would the high priest in the temple, in the sacred part of the temple, go in and utter the name Yahweh, and you assign vowels to this signifier. Okay? So I was taking a course when I was an undergraduate from a scripture scholar who taught at the University of Chicago for many years. He was a Hebrew specialist. And we were talking about this. He said, no, Patrick, you don't understand. He says, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text translated this as I am who am. But this guy's name is J. Coward Rothersdale. And he said to me, there is no verb to be in ancient Hebrew. And maybe Richard knows, am I right or not? Maybe someone who studied ancient Hebrew knows more about this than I do, so I'll refer. But I'm getting this from what I consider to be a reliable authority. He said there is no verb to be in ancient Hebrew. There's only a verb that means to become, and that same verb means to show yourself or to manifest yourself, to appear, right? So that the ancient Hebrew name for God, right, which is an unpronounceable word, means I will show myself to you as I show myself to you. Don't expect to look for me in the same place next time.
You got a lot more work.
Yeah, right? Because it means becoming, okay? Because it means becoming and manifestation and appearance, okay? So it's not I am who am, but it's I will become what I will become, okay? And the Greeks translated that as I am who am because the Greeks had this verb to be. So the English translations for the name of God, right, are based on this Greek conception. Now, what's an idol? An idol is when you make an image, you have a signifier of some kind, right? I'm just going to, can you see these words? Signifier and signified. This is the Caesarean description of the sign. Okay, so a sign is something that we see with our eyes, or we touch with our hands, or hear with our ears. So so that's the signifier. And so an idol is when you lock a signified, a particular concept to a signifier. What the name of God here is a signifier without a signified.